just as a reminder, I know in previous consults we've not recorded. We are recording this consult, so do what you need to do to feel comfortable with that. You can have your video on or off. We will stop the recording before the case consultation. And just as a reminder, everything shared in this group with the consultations is considered privileged information, and we're all responsible for maintaining confidentiality. Also, just as group and community norms, when you turn your microphone on to speak, please introduce yourself with your name and your pronouns. And just as a reminder, in this group, we address many intersections of neurodiversity, including sexual identity, gender identity, racism, classism, ableism. We are all in the process of unlearning abusive systems. So when somebody calls you in, we're going to be supportive to protect from shame spirals. All right. So today we have Dr. Erin Harp here. I'm so excited. Erin, do you want to take over from here?
Sure. Thanks for having me. It's really fun to be here. It's great to see you, Marie. I am a little under the weather, so I'm going to do my best not to cough on y'all. I'm glad we're not in person. Let me just start by sharing my screen here, and all right. All right. Are we seeing slides, everyone? Excellent. So today we'll be talking about the intersections of weight stigma, diet culture, eating disorders, and neurodiverse clients. Just a tiny bit about me. This is me. I'm Erin. I use they, them pronouns. I'm currently here at the University of Denver, but I did work for 7 years as a social worker at Seattle Children's Hospital. And I also kind of partner with a variety of agencies that kind of do work around weight stigma and kind of fighting diet culture. In terms of my identities, which I do like to acknowledge because they influence my perspective and also kind of, create things that I might see better or things that I might fail to see in my perspective. So I identify as a white, mid-fat, queer, neurodiverse, non-binary person, currently in good health, but with a history of disability and thinness, which has also shaped my experience and my perspective. Within this, I will also just let you all know I am not a neurodiversity expert at all. And so even though I am a part of the community, this is not my area of expertise. And so I really invite, as I am presenting today, if you can get a word in edgewise, please feel free to unmute yourself if there's language that I could use that is better. I am absolutely open to those call-ins and appreciate it. And also don't feel like you need to do it. You can also, send me a little message later and let me know. And that is fine as well. I'm hoping in 45 minutes to cover an introduction to weight stigma and diet culture, a little bit of the science of weight and health from a more critical perspective, a brief overview of how eating disorders and neurodiverse folks intersect, and then what we can do clinically to try and support not like all of our clients in terms of pushing back against diet culture and weight stigma, but particularly our neurodiverse folks. So I always start every talk with a little bit on language, because whenever I talk about bodies and fatness and weight stigma, people always say, like, I don't know how to talk about this. And like, what words do I use? And so, there aren't a lot of good rules out there, and language is one of those things that, especially in activist communities, is always evolving as we explore how language is used as a tool to oppress people or recreate societal oppression. So keep in mind, these are loose suggestions for you to explore within your own communities. In general, people in the fat community overwhelmingly do not prefer the words that we call them the O words: obese, morbidly obese, overweight. And so anytime that you have a chance to not use those words, I encourage you to stay away from them. Other words that I stay away from are things like skinny, which I think is pretty societally charged in terms of value. Unhealthy or healthy weight, because as we'll discover, that's not a very clear-cut issue. Normal weight, which then means there's abnormal weights, right? Ideal body weight, ideal weight. Again, these are all things that kind of stick to this kind of one normalizing or ideal body. And similarly with anorexic weight, people with anorexia can present all across the weight spectrum. So avoiding terminology like that is also useful. In terms of preferred terms, just as in the community, the queer community or the Chicana community, certain words are being reclaimed that used to be used as slurs. So too is the word fat being reclaimed by some members of the fat community. So feel free to use the term fat as a neutral descriptor. Sometimes if I were in person with you, I'd have us practice saying this together, right? Like, I have a fat presenter today. Erin's body is mid-fat. The pumpkin I carved at Halloween was fat. My cat is fat, right? Like we just practice normalizing how can we use fat as a normal descriptor as opposed to a word that has to have kind of a heavier emotional charge. I will add that my rule is that I don't use fat for someone's body unless they've used it for themselves. All right. Because it still does have some kind of difficult connotations for people. So in general, if I'm talking about someone else's body, I'm usually going to ask them, what words do you use to describe your body? And then I kind of follow suit with what words feel comfortable for them. Other words that I use are things like high weight, higher weight, larger bodied, thin bodied, person with thin privilege. Sometimes people will use the term a person of size. I think that's a little unspecific. And if you're in a scientific or medical space where you have to use the O words, I always recommend adding the caveat according to current BMI standards, because those terms overweight and obese are terms that just change based on literally a committee of people voting on them at the CDC. So that is how those words are established. They are not actually backed in weight science, as we will discover. So I like to add that caveat to let people know that there's a little bit of frivolity involved with those words. All right, so let's dive in a little bit into weight stigma. And so y'all know, I really like using visuals in my presentations. I don't always discuss them. I'm happy to return to any of them that you wish, but many of the drawings and the art that you'll see in here are from patients with eating disorders who have described their experience in pictures. And I tried for this presentation to also highlight clients with eating disorders who are also neurodiverse for y'all. So those are some of the things that you will be seeing here. So what is weight stigma? It is a systematic value system that values smaller bodies over larger bodies. And this integrates through all parts of our culture: financially, employment, the medical system, healthcare, mental health care, our education system, as we'll see. And that is supported in large part by diet culture, which is a really pervasive set of beliefs that just integrates so much of our society and our culture today. And one of the main components of diet culture is that valuing thinness and seeing only thinness as attractive is one of the main components. It's also, thinness is viewed at the expense often of actual health and emotional well-being, which is an important critique of diet culture. Within diet culture, we also see things like good foods versus bad foods, or believing that you are a good or bad person based on the foods that you eat. We also see moralizing body size. We also see moralizing health, right? Like, well, it's okay if you're fat as long as you're healthy. Right. We'll also see a focus on calorie restriction and weight loss, just in general. People just assume that everybody needs to lose weight or restrict what they are eating to some extent. Or you'll also see this when it shows up. You know, I had this happen the other day. Someone's like, "Oh, you look great. Have you lost weight?" No, I haven't. Right. So that automatic assumption that anything weight loss or anything pretty means thin, that's all a reflection of diet culture. And often as a part of this, we see this kind of self-deprecating self-talk that people will demonstrate towards themselves and then also towards other people. And that becomes modeled and remodeled for children on social media, in our families, in our school systems, even in politics. We will see politicians even being critiqued on their, capability just based on their body weight and what they are presumed to eat. So I wanted to do just a brief little exercise with you all, but we're going to go through a series of public health ads that I'm going to describe to you. And I want you all to pay attention to what you feel in your body in terms of physical sensations and what emotions might come up for you. Okay, so this ad here, this is a ad campaign, a public health ad campaign from Georgia, which is the state with the highest rates of fat children. This is from 2012. You're seeing black and white pictures of children, probably between 8 and 14 years old. There's red warning signs across their bellies. They are cropped so that they barely kind of fit in the pictures. You can just see their faces and the kind of upper part of their chests. The warning label says things like chubby kids may not outlive their parents. Fat kids become fat adults. Big bones didn't make me this way. Big meals did. He has his father's eyes, his laugh, and maybe even his diabetes. StopChildhoodObesity.com. This is from the Don't Get Smacked by Fat public health campaign in Boston in 2011. We see 3 individuals. It looks to be all folks of color. They are drinking, well, the first 2 are drinking beverages that are kind of brownish or reddish. There's a sign that says, don't get smacked by fat. Calories from sugary drinks can cause obesity and type 2 diabetes. And then there's these kind of disembodied globs of fat that are literally smacking these folks in the face, making them kind of make grimacing expressions. This campaign is from the New York Cut Your Portions, Cut Your Risk campaign from 2012. We're seeing a person of a large-bodied man of color. We actually can't see his face because it has been cut off, but we can see his larger body. He's sitting on a stool. I'm assuming gender here. I'm realizing that I probably should not assume a gender based on this. The model here has a leg amputated under the knee and crutches in the background. There's 3 cups in various sizes from then to now, showing an increase in beverage size. It looks like a brown kind of cola liquid. It says portions have grown, so has type 2 diabetes, which can lead to amputations. Cut your portions, cut your risk. My favorite part, call 311 for your healthy eating packet. All right. So we can use, I guess for this part, we can use both chat or if you would like to speak, but I'm wondering, what do you notice? How do we feel in our bodies? Who do you notice is pictured and what emotions are evoked? So if you have any responses to those, feel free to either unmute or put your responses in the text. Mostly people of color. Yes, the words provoke shame. Yes, this feeling of dirtiness, angry, feeling uncomfortable, offended. I'm sorry I did this to you first thing in the morning, y'all. There will be better pictures later on. I have palette cleansers for you. A lot of rage. And a part of me was like, but it's science, right? So we have this connection with health rhetoric, public health rhetoric, rates of obesity, rates of type 2 diabetes. feeling upset for the children who had to model. Of note, the last person in this, this gentleman here, who I actually do know is a man. I was just saying from the picture, you wouldn't be able to necessarily tell, but he actually is not missing a leg. This was photoshopped, and he was not informed that it would be photoshopped in this way. And he ended up suing the advertising campaign for false representation. Feeling angry, a desire to argue with the people who created these things. Yes. You know, so yes, this cropping of the bodies to make it look like they don't fit, when many times fat children are already going to feel as if they don't fit in, right? As if their bodies make them different and somehow bad. Yes, this that they probably told these kids not to smile, that there's this this attempt to make these children look pathetic and sad, right? And lonely. When we don't actually know the social lives or conditions or the talents or strengths that these children undoubtedly have. Of note, there was an ad campaign in Georgia that sprang up in response to this called the I Stand campaign, where they pictured all forms of diversity, whole pictures of people of all different colors, ages, sizes, genders, putting affirming messages for child and body diversity. And the public health system actually launched a counter campaign against that body positive campaign, because they were so upset at activists promoting body positivity. Yeah, this mug shot characteristic, right? The black and white with the sign. Yeah, so we definitely, we see an overrepresentation of folks of color. We see photo strategies to make bodies look bigger, and or big bodies look as if they don't fit. There's this kind of shame in this one with this headless fatty phenomenon, which is what that's called, when people literally take off somebody's face because it's assumed that their bodies are so shameful that they would not want their face associated with their body. And the children one, yes, it brought up parent guilt as well, right? That our children could be inheriting all of our bad habits and health things, when, you know, genetics is a main driver in diabetes, and not an issue of shame to have a genetic inheritance. So yes, there's this messaging that people don't know that their bodies are like, that people need to be informed that they are in large bodies, even though if you have ever been in a large body, you know that you're aware of that. Society makes it very clear to you, you do not need to be informed that your body is larger than somebody else's. And the irony of being pathologized and shamed for your body and then being offered a healthy eating packet, like they somehow didn't get that memo that their body wasn't acceptable, and that a healthy eating packet could fix the problem. Right? That like all you need to do is call a number and get a healthy eating packet mailed to you. A packet, right? Information, literally no food, no resources, just a packet of information mailed to you. So this very kind of patronizing view towards people, health, and weight. Yes, and this comment that yes, portions change, that's a systemic issue, not an individual one. And even though portions have changed, our bodies are still amazing homeostatic machines that can address internal cues for hunger and fullness. So this really teaches a distrust of our bodies and a distrust of the cues that we receive. Okay. Yeah, chubby is a word that I associate with being affectionate, and it bugs me that it's being seen as shamey here. Yes, for you know, we see that too with big boned and some of these other words that kind of become euphemisms to infer shame. All right, I'm going to move on, but I'm glad I wanted you all to see the intersections with race, with gender, with age, also with disability, right? This person is being criticized for having had an amputation. There were similar ads in that campaign that criticized people using mobility devices and wheelchairs. And so this is really the intersections of weight stigma are so powerfully entwined with other areas of stigma within society. So we know that weight stigma disproportionately impacts women and femmes, disproportionately impacts certain ethnic groups, Weight stigma contributes to ableism. It's going to disproportionately impact those in poverty. So our zip code is a better predictor of our health than our weight is. Weight standards impact access to affordability of healthcare, and it also impacts things like who is eligible for things like fertility treatments, gender affirmation surgeries, or even things like knee replacement in orthopedic surgery. All right. A few of the consequences of weight stigma. One of the most common consequences of attempting to lose weight is becoming involved in a weight cycle, which means you gain weight, lose weight, gain weight, lose weight, gain weight, lose weight. And that cycling in weight has been linked with increased mortality and the same health consequences that are actually linked with high weight. So things like higher blood pressure, diabetes, and some of the other cancer risks that you often see. We also see weight stigma being associated with increased disordered eating, eating disorders, and increased severity of disordered eating. So people who have experienced weight stigma often experience more severe eating disorders. We see it contributing to weight-based bullying, with weight-based bullying being one of the leading contributors to youth suicidality. It creates distrust in the public health and medical system, where adults who are in larger bodies are less likely to see a physician. They're less likely to get as much time with their physician when they do see them. They're less likely to be touched by nurses when they go in for an exam. They're more likely to be seen negatively by mental health providers, including therapists. And larger adults also experience discriminatory hiring and promotion practices. They are paid less than their thinner counterparts. And particularly for women, women who are in larger bodies are less likely to be funded by their parents in higher education. So these incidences of weight stigma are far-reaching throughout all different facets of people's lives. And then just on the health side, just like we see that kind of chronic stress degradation of our immune system when we experience stigma, we also see that same chronic stress health impacts for people experiencing weight stigma. So we see decreased immune system, heart disease, high blood pressure, higher blood sugar, digestive issues, nerve problems, and things like migraines, anxiety, depression for people who are experiencing weight stigma. So I am going to nerd out for, I don't know, maybe 7 minutes on weight science, okay? So work with me here. But I want to kind of bring a critical perspective to some of the science that correlates weight with health, okay? I'm not saying that there's no connection, because there's absolutely a connection between weight and health. But the argument I'm going to make for you today is that that connection between weight and health may be less attributable to the actual adipose tissue in people's bodies and more attributable to the stigma of that adipose tissue from other folks. So this first diagram is from one of our main obesity journals, and it's documenting all of the things that have been scientifically correlated with higher weight in children. All right, and you can see here that it's correlated with gender, dietary intake, sedentary behavior, age, physical activity, nutritional knowledge, what foods are in the home, their parents' level of activity, whether or not their mom was a teen parent, whether or not their mom smoked, right? There are so many factors within this wheel, and this is not a complete representation. But what I'm hoping to show you here is that the connection between weight and health, and the connection between how do people get to higher weights, is so much more than just calories in and calories out, which is what the healthcare industry and the diet industry largely kind of tout to people, that it's just about what you eat and how much you exercise, when in reality, it also is linked with rurality and zip code and what you do in your leisure time, whether or not your schools have PE programs, right? There are so many things in this circle of factors that are not within an individual's control, and that are beyond just a simple calories in, calories out. Similarly, and I'm going to just briefly summarize this study, but in our NHANES database, which is one of the largest nutritional databases that we have in the US, it's nationally representative. This particular and it's also a longitudinal database. So we've tracked this data over many, many years in the US. And in this study of over 40,000 individuals, they compared BMI markers with actual metabolic health. And what they found is that almost half of people in the overweight BMI category were metabolically healthy. Similarly, almost a third, so 29% of people in the obese category were metabolically healthy. And surprisingly for these scientists, 16% of people in the most severe category of obesity were still metabolically healthy. So we're talking about things like blood pressure, blood sugars, cholesterol, those indicators. And furthermore, 30% of people who were considered ideal body weight were metabolically unhealthy. And so I bring this up to you because nowhere else in medicine do we accept measures that are this inaccurate, right? If we had a test like a thermometer, it was like, well, you know, between 1 out of 2 and 1 out of 5 times, it'll be right, right? Like we're not going to use that thermometer as an indicator for how we should instruct somebody else to live their life, right? And so I point this out because BMI and weight are just very, very rough estimates of some of these actual health indicators that we're really concerned about, things like blood pressure, blood sugar, cholesterol. So we can do better as a medical group. Similarly, this is a curve of all-cause mortality. So what you see here along the bottom is BMI, and what you see here around the y-axis, so the axis going up, is how likely you are to die from any cause. And so you want to be low, right? Because low means you're not going to die. You're less likely to die. And you can see that the nadir, so the least likely you are to die, kind of occurs between a BMI of 25 and a BMI of 35. So those are actually folks who have the lowest all-cause mortality across the BMI spectrum. And you can see that as people get very thin or as people get fatter, that increase for mortality increases. And so it actually, like if we're thinking just about all-cause mortality, like that ideal BMI range of 18.5 to 25 is not actually what we would be shooting for if we were looking at things like all-cause mortality. There it is. Okay. Similarly, this is from just examining some of the longer outcomes of dieting. We see here again that in general, if you take a group of folks who are considered higher body weight before dieting, and you look at their outcomes 5 years later after dieting, you see that it is quite rare that somebody will go from a higher body weight to an ideal body weight. In fact, there we go. The odds of attaining a normal BMI from dieting in this study was between 0.1 and 1%, and maintaining it at that 5-year mark. All right. And then you see many people whose weight has kind of stayed the same. And then this also trend for people to gain weight over time when they engage in dieting behaviors. And so what these authors concluded is that because the likelihood of becoming ideal weight was so low and the likelihood of actually gaining weight over time was much higher, they thought that this recommendation for dieting was potentially, a potential harm for clients when you consider the likely outcomes of that. And then also, I wanted to just also point out, so that cycling that I pointed out, that weight cycling, going from a higher weight to a lower weight to a higher weight to a lower weight, that has been connected across multiple large studies with adverse health outcomes and some of the same adverse health outcomes that are associated with high weight. So for instance, here we see it's associated with cardiovascular mortality. We see here in this middle study that it was weight fluctuations and not stable obesity that was driving many of these poor health outcomes. And so people who stayed obese without that weight fluctuation actually had better outcomes than people who lost weight and then regained it. And then in other studies here, we see that weight fluctuations have been linked with things like osteoporosis, gallstones, muscle atrophy, hypertension, inflammation, kidney disease, endometrial cancer. So I bring this up because that general suggestion of if someone is in a higher weight category to just lose weight can actually be harming our clients incidentally. Okay, so we got about a little bit of time to talk about eating disorders and the intersection with neurodiverse folks. So I'm gonna scoot as much as I can through this. So in general, when we're talking about eating disorders, we're talking about a constellation of symptoms and behaviors and experiences that kind of revolve around this list of things. So we're talking about restricting food. So that's eliminating certain types of foods that you eat, and limiting the amount that you eat. So engaging in self-starvation, purging, which can happen through kind of self-induced vomiting or other things like compulsive exercise or abuse of laxatives and diuretics. We also see obsession and compulsion with exercise. We see binge behaviors where people feel out of control when eating food. Sometimes that's when eating a large amount of food, and sometimes that's when just eating a normal amount of food, but somebody feels out of control often and almost all the time because they've actually restricted prior to that binge. We also see obsessions, so obsessions around food and calorie counting, cutting things up. We see food rituals and behaviors. Concerns with body image, where body image becomes like a main driving obsession and negative experience for people. And then, of course, overlap with other mental health diagnoses. And it's a huge time, energy, life suck. It's just, that's probably the thing that people complain about the most besides body image. I have this handy dandy little drawing that I made for you about the eating disorders in the DSM. In general, we have anorexia nervosa, which is characterized by self-starvation mainly and body image concerns. Atypical anorexia is the same thing as anorexia nervosa, except it occurs in people with BMIs over 18.5. So I point that out because you can see anorexia behaviors all across the weight spectrum, whether a person is presenting as thin or if they're presenting in a larger body. We also see bulimia and binge eating disorder also all across the weight spectrum. Bulimia is characterized by a binge and purge cycle, and binge eating disorder is characterized by binge cycles. And I would also add by restriction, because restriction feeds that binge cycle. People often will binge, feel guilty about it, then restrict, then binge again. And then over here on this other side of this dotted line, all of these ones over here, the anorexia, binge eating disorder, and bulimia, are all associated with things like negative body image and internal cognitive experiences. But across this dotted line, we have things that are a little bit more sensory based. So things like avoidant and restrictive feeding disorder, rumination disorder, and pica. These are eating disorders that have a lot more to do with kind of self-soothing and or sensory choices or anxiety around food, as opposed to concerns that are solely rooted in body image and fat phobia. So with someone with avoidant and restrictive feeding and intake disorder, we might see somebody who has a very, very limited food palette and just not very many choices that feel safe for them to engage eating. So a main challenge with these folks who have what we call ARFID, that's the concise, or what is it called, abbreviation? Anyway, it has a name.
Acronym.
Thank you, Marie, acronym. So with our ARFID folks, a main focus of treatment is helping tolerate the anxiety and sensory issues that come up when people try different foods, and then expanding that food palette so that they can really truly enjoy more food experiences and live with a little bit more freedom in their lives. All right. So that's my quick and dirty DSM. We can talk more about it later. There is a hierarchy in the DSM. So like anorexia trumps bulimia, and bulimia trumps binge eating disorder. But I want to point out that that doesn't necessarily reflect actual severity, and the severity markers in the DSM are not actually scientifically based off of studies that show that people with those severity markers actually have more severe impairment or quality of life. So just a note, there's a lot of focus on weight in the DSM that is just not very well supported in the scientific literature that's explored that. Diagnoses overlap. You hardly ever see someone with a kind of just, a straight up, this person only restricts and doesn't exercise and doesn't purge and doesn't binge. Most of the time, I think it's around half of people with anorexia have a binge purge subtype. So they also engage in purging, and about a third of them, or so about half purge, and about a third of people with anorexia also binge. All right, so you can see that there's a tremendous overlap in symptoms and behaviors. Again, as I mentioned, restriction feeds binge cycles, and eating disorders occur in all genders, ages, weights, socioeconomic statuses, races, and sexuality spectrums. And eating disorders are actually increasing most in some of the groups that we previously thought were less at risk for eating disorders. So we're actually seeing lots of increases right now for eating disorders in men, in older individuals, and in some racial minority groups. And also, because this also relates to our neurodiverse folks, folks that are trans and non-binary are about 4 times more likely to have an eating disorder than cisgender women and girls. So our trans and non-binary populations are much more at risk. And we also see that our neurodiverse communities are more at risk, where we see high rates of comorbidity, particularly for people who are autistic, who have OCD or ADHD. And this is one of, this image you see is art from a neurodiverse non-binary participant in the study, who in the white wrote what they have heard from mental health and medical providers, and in blue wrote things that they wish they had heard from their providers. And I always point out that the blue are really not that hard to say, right? I hear you, you matter, I believe what you're saying. You must be frustrated, reasonably so. All right. So some of the specific issues that come up for our neurodiverse folks, and lots of credit to Ellie, who helped me in brainstorming some of these things. And then I've kind of brought in some of the literature as well. We see, and this is art from another neurodiverse person with an eating disorder who was in my study, kind of reflecting on like what it's like to try and fit in to societal norms as somebody both with a larger body and who is this particular participant in my research was autistic. So these pressures of masking and fitting in are compounded for neurodiverse folks. Often concerns about body image can really play into those masking attempts and those attempts to fit in. Sometimes it's just in terms of fitting into body image ideals, and other times it's kind of mimicking that adherence to social norms of diet culture, right? Like how people talk about their bodies and about how they wish their bodies were. And just wanted to highlight here the importance of those intersections, again, of gender and size, so that people who are feeling, oh, and I should have put race on here too. People who are feeling othered because of other visual characteristics like their gender presentation, their size, or their race, oftentimes that is highlighted even more when they are in positions of being multiply marginalized. We also see a lot of issues with neurodiverse folks and sensory issues and issues around interoceptive awareness. So often in our neurodiverse populations, we can see that kind of link between what's happening in our body and what we know is happening in our body can be a little less reliable than we want it to be, a little less attuned. So that can make it difficult for people to understand when they are hungry or when they are full. Sometimes that means that people can be so separated from their hunger cues that they might faint or have brain fog or be in a really poor mood before they realize that they're actually just hungry and they need to eat. And I think there's also a lot of increased tolerance for this, or at least this is what I see clinically, is that people have like an unbelievable ability to tolerate these negative body states because they are more common. Also, when people restrict or when people experience trauma, we also see interruptions with interoception. So that's, and we also know that trauma co-occurs with eating disorders as well. We also see a lot of moralizing of foods, coping, comfort, stimming, dopamine seeking. So when people are having these sensations or going through these kind of dopamine seeking or stimming behaviors, maybe they're wanting crunchy or sour or sweet or salty foods or that type of thing. Oftentimes that can be labeled as binging or mislabeled as binging. We can moralize the types of foods that people find comfortable or that people find useful in coping. We can even moralize people being comforted by food and say that that's not an okay thing for you to be comforted. Also moralizing of what they call highly palatable foods in the research. And then I also wanted to draw the attention to with this kind of sensory and sensation issues, we often see an overlap with purging as well, because purging also has a dopamine release that's associated with it. It also has sensory issues in terms of gastric stretching that are relieved. So those are things that commonly occur. And we're also going to see a lot of this interoception interruption if somebody has been restricted and has not eaten enough, and now they need to refeed and restore their body to a place of being nourished. And oftentimes these issues can become really complicated and difficult to tolerate. And so things like teaching distress tolerance, how do we tune into our bodies? And then how do we cope when we tune into our bodies and it is uncomfortable? Because refeeding is not a comfortable process at all. Also, and you'll see this in eating disorders and in many of our neurodiverse populations, there's a lot of emphasis on concrete thinking, black and white thinking, rule following, and a lot of obsessive absorption and fixation around things like foods, what foods are good or bad, calories, how many calories are in certain foods, how many calories you burn doing certain things. Individuals develop rules, and then their rules develop rules. And then, they have this whole list of things that can kind of dictate their experience of food, body, and exercise. And I think for neurodiverse folks, we are just primed to really just plug in and go in this area. So these behaviors can become quite extreme in neurodiverse folks. And then also sometimes just diet culture as an interest can become really fascinating for folks. So whether that's through social media, TikTok, kind of books that people read, information that people gather, this can also be, somewhat of a fun thing for people to kind of nerd out about when they are getting absorbed and interested in some of the intricacies of weight, body, and calories. And then, of course, violation of any of these rules can bring that kind of spiral of shame that we see. And then the last thing I wanted to point out with this group was the importance of identity exploration. This has not made it to the literature yet. This is something that I'm seeing as a clinician and I'm seeing in my own research. But one of the things that I consistently see, especially within neurodiverse people who have been in the studies that I've done with eating disorders, is that learning to explore their different identities, both their neurodiverse identity and things like their gender identity, their racial identity, all of those things help an individual kind of make peace with who they are and how their body fits into that story of who they are. I say here, making peace, ? With body size, because that's always like a goal that clinicians have for patients. And also, I just don't know how realistic or possible it is. And I haven't seen a lot of literature that really points to it being realistic or possible, but I do think we can become more peaceful with our bodies and with our internal experiences, and we can become more tolerant, and they can take up a lot less of our time. And here, this is again, more art from another neurodiverse client, also who is non-binary, who has kind of described their eating disorder as this box of conformity with this pink, red bow of femininity that they used to feel like they had to fit into. And, their queer identity was locked outside the box, and everybody was congratulating them and giving them love and respect for being a healthy weight. And then their eating disorder, this black little eel, kind of took over and controlled their life. And then they grabbed a sword and started fighting their eating disorder. And now they see themselves in more of an androgynous body versus one ruled by femininity. And they kind of see themselves evolving into this beautiful amorphous octopus in the background with these various parts of their identity that they have and their life that is starting to take up more of their life than this eating disorder did. All right, so in the last few minutes, I just wanted to cover what do we do as clinicians with this information? How do we best support our clients? I have a few questions here just in terms of Think about this later on your own time. These are reflection questions around weight bias. So how do I feel when I work with people of different body sizes? Do I make assumptions regarding a person's character, intelligence, abilities, health, or behaviors based on what their weight looks like to me? What stereotypes do I have about larger bodied patients? What might I assume they eat? How might I assume they exercise? How do I think they think about their bodies? How do I think their body image is? How do my larger bodied patients feel when they leave my office? And then finally, do honest answers to these questions fit with my values as a clinician? Because culture is everywhere, we have to help our clients reject it. Thin, as we saw, does not mean equal healthy. 30% of people in that ideal BMI range actually were metabolically unhealthy. Being thin is not an accomplishment. Being fat is not a shame. There is danger in reinforcing thinness, even for thin people. You could be reinforcing an eating disorder, an illness, a bout of depression, many, many things. You might have to be the model of this for patients. You might be the only person in their life that has a countercultural attitude about diet culture. You might be the only person in their life that views their body as acceptable as it is. We are immersed in diet culture and it feels inescapable. Our patients and the parents that we're working with might come to us with a very weight-focused mind frame. And so we can, as clinicians, use our power and privilege to model acknowledging body diversity and weight-inclusive practices. One of the ways that we can do this is by focusing on how multifactorial health is, that health is not just about one blood pressure reading or one blood sugar reading or your BMI. It is a holistic picture of how a person is and functions in the world, including their emotional and intellectual well-being, their physical, social, environmental, financial, spiritual. What aspects of this are important to your clients? And often that's where I start with clients, is where do you want to focus in this wheel? What would be best in terms of improving your quality of life? I also wanted to put a plug in for HAES. HAES stands for Health at Every Size. I also want to acknowledge that this HAES has been critiqued, and reasonably so, for many different things, including overly focusing on health at the expense of other issues, and also moralizing health. So sometimes falling victim to that, okay, it's okay if you're in a larger size as long as you're healthy. It's also been critiqued for having a white focus, which has been changing in recent years with more and more folks of color's voices being elevated in this discussion, but it is still a space that is often largely dominated by white voices. The tenets of HAES include weight inclusivity, so accepting and recognizing size diversity, health enhancement, focusing on improving health within that individual's specific circumstances. So how do we enhance health given kind of the ability status and the limitations and the realities of this person's life? Respectful care, the fact that everybody, regardless of your body size, regardless of your ability, deserves respectful, discrimination-free healthcare. Eating for well-being, and life-enhancing movement. So as we're choosing ways to move our bodies, how do we move in ways that feel life-giving and fun and joyful? Just wanted to give you some of the evidence for this approach. There's a lot of studies that support focusing on health behaviors and health enhancement as opposed to focusing on weight, but I wanted to give you my favorite one. So this was looking at hazard ratios again for all-cause mortality. So on this y-axis, the one that goes up and down, the higher you get, the more likely you are to die, basically. All right. Across here, in the dark bars, we have people who are in obese BMI. In the middle bars, we have people who are in the overweight BMI. Here are all my scare quotes. And in the lightest color, we have people who are in ideal BMIs. Then I'm got to break it down. This is a complicated graph, but we're going to get through it, y'all. As you go across the x-axis, these are 0 health behaviors, 1 health behavior, 2 health behaviors, 3 health behaviors, or 4 health behaviors. And these health behaviors are either eating 5 fruits and vegetables a day, exercising regularly, having moderate alcohol use, or not smoking. So if you do just If you don't do any of those things, so if you don't eat fruits and vegetables, you don't exercise, you drink alcohol to excess, and you smoke, then if you're in a thin body, you can see your your hazard ratio is around 2. If you're overweight, it's around 4. And if you're obese, it's up to almost 7. And you can see that's what we usually see in our public health rhetoric, right? That the heavier you are, the more chance you have of dying. If you add just one health behavior, so for instance, if you just don't smoke, then the hazard ratios drop down almost equal, right? So you can see that everybody's kind of hovering around, between 2 and 4, right? If you add just 2 of those behaviors, so if you don't smoke and you don't drink alcohol in excess, you're actually doing better than thin folks in that very first category, right? By the time you get to all 4 of those health behaviors, there's no difference between those BMI categories and their health outcomes, right? So really, this is such a strong argument for focusing on health behaviors that people can control as opposed to focusing on weight. All right, so my last 2 slides, y'all, and then I'll stop. We can open up for discussion because I know I'm over. I apologize. I just have some ideas here for fighting diet culture within neurodiverse folks. First, again, is that self-reflection part on your part as the practitioner. What are your assumptions? How do you kind of bring a more neutral lens? Second is, how do we honor all foods and bodies and avoid shaming and creating rules? De-emphasizing weight. So we don't necessarily need to discuss it. It's probably very rare that weight actually is, we might need it for things like medication dosing. We might need it for things like anesthesia. But beyond that, it really doesn't necessarily need to be a part of the conversation. We can talk about other things like health behaviors. Screening for eating disorders in your clients. Attending, and I would say especially for kiddos in transition periods, that's when we often see kind of eating disorder behaviors start. Attending to issues of interoception, so that fostering that body connection, helping people identify hunger and fullness cues. Biofeedback strategies have been really useful for this, especially for people who have also experienced co-occurring trauma. Helping your clients identify fat phobia and weight stigma and diet culture, and then calling it out for them. Call it out for them when you see it in their worlds, when you see it in your own world, in yourself, in your office that you work. And then this last one, promoting freedom, being cautious of restrictive mindsets. I included this, we don't have to go through it now, but I included some other, tips about things like avoiding numbers, being a food anthropologist, right? So be curious and open, like, how does this taste? If you were trying this food for the first time and you were an alien on another planet, how would they describe this food? Just not commenting on anyone's weight or your own. We don't need to hear about it. If you are worried because you notice a change in someone's weight, ask them how they're doing. Ask them if they're okay. You don't need to talk about their weight. So ensuring accessibility. Oh, I love this one for kids. Highlighting fat representation. Show kids fat athletes and artists and activists. Also, show fat, normal people living normal, happy lives. Like, fat joy is a thing. Fat people have families and jobs. They are educated. They have hobbies. And oftentimes there's just such a dismal discourse about fatness that people think that it's a death sentence, and it's not. Affirming that bodies change. I hate this one. With time, life stage, illness, and disability, right? That the body we have today is different than the one we'll have tomorrow, the one we'll have in several years. Normalize that for folks. We're not supposed to be the same people we were when we were 17. And then lastly, that note about promoting intersectional self-discovery. So I think with that, here's our palate cleanser. This is from a client who drew their eating disorder as this kind of attempt to fit into this row of thin, blonde, feminine paper dolls. And they drew their recovery as this process of, you can see now they're in a fatter body. They are no longer wearing a dress, and they have this kind of frizzy brown hair, and they're kind of floating above the paper dolls they titled this Out of the Framework. So I think I'll end there, and whoever's leading this, you can help me know what comes next.
So we have a few minutes for questions, answers. I just want to say I'm so grateful. Thank you so much for sharing with us. I learned a lot of new things. This was awesome. A thought that I had while you were talking about risk factors in neurodivergent folks was also just anecdotally a strength. I've noticed with neurodivergent clients that social justice sensitivity can be supportive. So when people start to recognize like this is really systemically unjust, that can actually be a strength for moving out of some eating disorder behaviors.
I wish, and I appreciate the call in with this. I did not highlight the strengths of our neurodiverse folks in this. And that is a big whoopsie on my part. Because in addition to the social justice, there's also a willingness to self-embody and kind of be themselves. At least I find this in many of my clients once they've done some of that identity exploration work. I think that's partly why I was highlighting that intersectional identity exploration as being so important and informative for neurodiverse folks in their recovery processes. But I feel like there is an ability to really push back against some of these systems once we're able to help clients have language around it and kind of identify. And then all of that interest and strength and fascination can also be harnessed back against the eating disorder as well. And so that can be a real strength for folks. Thank you for bringing that up. And I'm sorry I did not highlight that more within the presentation.
I have a question. So I'll start by saying, Erin, you're dope. Thank you so much. Great use of my time. I've learned so much. I want to ask then, so thinking about how helpful physical exercise can be for everybody, just from a mental health standpoint, how can I potentially talk about this topic with my clients in a fat affirming, neurodiverse affirming way without them thinking that I want them to lose weight when I really just want them to love themselves? Because that's what I believe. Because it's when you work with your body, you're loving yourself. So
absolutely. There's a lot of research out here on how to do this. I think one of the things we have to be really careful about is that anytime, if a person's in a larger body, and sometimes even when a person's in a thinner body, conversations around exercise or body movement can feel really shaming, or like, I'm telling you to do this for a certain way. So I think naming that from the get-go is really important, to acknowledge that, like, even just bringing it up can feel shaming to somebody. And so I think addressing diet culture, specifically addressing the flaws and the harms of diet culture, letting them know that this is where you're coming from, letting them know that weight is not a reliable indicator of health, and physical movement and being in your body can be enjoyable. And I think that can be, especially when you have folks with eating disorders or who are in fatter bodies, especially if it overlaps and they have both, that thought of reapproaching exercise can feel really, really scary. And you might, and I will also preface, if you have clients who have had compulsive exercise and exercise addictions, it might be best for them not to be in exercise for a while. And so that's a very likely outcome for some folks. But when people start to reapproach, the focus should really be on that embodied experience. There's some really fun research on how to do exercise therapy with clients, where you're doing things that highlight interoceptive awareness. So you're doing things like maybe stretching, and you're saying like, okay, like, what does your body feel like when you stretch this far? Okay, now if we stretch maybe 1 more inch, now how is your body feeling? Is that a good sensation or a bad sensation? Can you stay with it? Should you stay with it? And actually have a conversation with your client. And you can do this in the office, right? Like with a stretch or something like that, and kind of work through some of those interoceptive signals that a body gives back to a person. There are exercise therapists that will actually exercise with clients too, right? So you can do those same types of activities if you're doing something like a run or playing a sport. And a lot of times it has to do with like, how do I know when to stop my body and how do I know when I'm enjoying my body? Another thing that I would add with this is really showing that body diversity in body movement. So, I just saw a video the other day on TikTok of a fat woman watching a fat ballerina. And just like her emotional reaction to seeing a body like hers, which was definitely in the a very fat body on stage. And the power of seeing, because often for fat people, they're not making athletic clothes in our size. They're not making athletic gear in our size. We're having to go special places to get knee pads to play volleyball, right? Like when we go to gyms, people are assuming we're there to lose weight. People are making comments like, good job, you, right? Like it's not a welcoming space for somebody who's in a fat body. Yes, thank you, Katya, for Lizzie dances. I love Eric Kavanaugh is another fat ballerina who's amazing. There's some great fat gymnasts that you can look up. The U.S. Women's Olympic powerlifting team has a lot of body diversity that represents kind of like a more like cylindrical, large fat shape that many people just don't associate with athletes. So like showing people that you can be athletic and embodied and high performance at an Olympic level and be in a body that's very large and stigmatized by society. But I think showing that and showing that not just to your fat clients, but show that to your thin clients, right? Like help them break down those barriers in their minds that the only people that can be athletic or can exercise are people in thin bodies. And then lastly, I would say, of course, to focus on enjoyment and redefine what exercise is. So often we're thinking about exercise and movement as like going to the gym, lifting weights, doing a spin class or a yoga class or CrossFit or whatever. It can also be playing football, with your friends at the lake. It can be Frisbee. It can be swimming. It can be walking around your neighborhood. It can be gardening, right? There's so many ways to be embodied, get connected to nature, and be connected with yourself that don't have to be in this kind of traditional, like, did you get your however many steps they're recommending currently right now?
I'd like to ask a question. I'm hoping you can offer some insight in ways I can approach. I'm working with a client who's neurodiverse and trans, and trying to find a surgeon that will do top surgery. And the one person they've found is making them or requiring they lose weight. I know this is a common thing. So one thing I've done is find referrals of surgeons that may not have that requirement. But they have chosen to start a diet or change their diet, I would say. So I'm trying to figure out how to, and we've both acknowledged how fucked up this is. But if there's I worry about the impact on their health of doing this so they can do something that will help them long-term feel better. So is there anything you could add to like having that disc exploration of how is this impacting your health, both mental and physical?
I'm so angry right now. And I just literally last night turned in a paper to one of our public health journals about trans people with eating disorders and the impact with gender affirming surgery and how that is, because literally a finding in my research was that was a trigger and a maintenance factor for eating disorders in trans and non-binary folks. This fear, and not just an unjustified fear, but a very justified fear that surgeons will deny surgery based on this. There's some really not great scientific literature. And by not great, I mean just like people try and use elective surgery literature in high weight people to apply it to trans people and then say that gender affirming surgery is elective and therefore we should use these other standards for weight, even though the reviews that we have on gender affirmation surgery and high weight status show that weight is not a risk factor for gender affirmation surgery. And that's both for mastectomy and for bottom surgery. So it's very frustrating to me that people are kind of weaponizing a surgical literature that's not even appropriate to the population that we are studying. I can get you 3 research articles, just to have as resources in case a surgeon is ever willing to have a discussion about why you are particularly concerned about the risk factor. And one of the things that my trans clients have pointed out to me as their concern is like, I don't want my body to be weaker when I'm trying to recover from surgery. And that is what happens when I restrict and I lose weight, is my body actually gets weaker. And that's the thing. That's a physiological reality when we're losing weight. In those types of ways, usually there's like our immune system is lowered and we're just like less robust overall. So I think I'm glad that you're having that communication with the patient. And I've also heard over and over, like, I'm only going to do this diet until I get my surgery. And then I'm going to go back and just let my body be. And some people are able to do that. And some people go on to develop an eating disorder. So that is a definite risk. I mean, my best advice would be to continue talking about it, kind of recognizing and also giving your client as much information as you can about it, like help them identify, yes, this is effed up, and it's not evidence-based. It's absolutely not evidence-based. And I'm sorry their surgeons not listening to the evidence that we have. I feel like it's going to take someone like suing a surgeon, right? Like, in terms of like eating disorder risk and or like unintended consequences. But I am so sorry, and I wish I had a better answer for you.
I would appreciate
wish
those
we-
articles.
Yes.
Erin, can I email
yes.
you and send those to everyone?
I can
Okay.
definitely give that to everybody.
And I want to keep talking about this, but we are really limited on time and have 2 case consults today. So I'm going to transition and make time for those case consults. Thank you so much for being here, Erin. This is really, really good.